ECHORIFT episode 248
is on. Welcome to the ECHORIFT show. I'm Don.
And I'm Mike.
And we're the creators of ECHORIFT Comics. Each episode we bring you the best in comics, movies, television, books, fast food, and anything else our producer can think of.
This time on a moonless night, the boys talk about American Wampire, Volume 1 by Scott Snyder.
It's funny that you said that because his newest comic is called Witches, and it's spelled W-V-I-T-C-H-E-S or something. So he's got the witches, Vampires, Mike. I don't think we've ever really spent any time talking about what we think of vampires, and I think this is probably the first vampire thing we've ever done on the show.
That may be the case. Then I have lost track of how many times we've talked or not talked about vampires, but you asked me once, Mike, what do you think of vampires? It was earlier in our friendship, and it was too soon for that question. and it was the 90s. And
so it was all Anne Rice.
Were very important.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise was making vampire movies.
Yeah.
Brad Pitt was turning gay women straight with vampire movies.
Yeah.
Because he looks so beautiful. So, I've never been a big vampire fan, Don.
I realize that I'm not a fan of vampires just on, it's almost like my opinion of horror. Like on face value, the word doesn't do anything for me. Although unlike horror, I don't think I've ever found that perfect vampire tale that had all the elements that I do like about vampires. Like I find that I like things like their agelessness. And I think that's some, like the Anne Rice books, I read all those because, like you said, it was the early 90s. People were reading Anne Rice books. And I really liked, I think, the second and the third one because it started getting into this legacy of vampires going all the way back to, like, Sumerian times. And that kind of stuff always fascinated me. I've, of course, never been interested in this sort of affectionate, mopey vampire. And I don't know. Like I like the idea, but I feel like it's never really been delivered with every piece that I like.
And you haven't seen any of the Twilight movies yet, right?
No, I've missed those.
Okay. Well, the hope is still out there for you, Don.
Because you've seen them, right?
Yes, and Don, you have to see. There's something new for you in those movies.
I think you would say that you're a student of the, not necessarily an aficionado, but a student of the Twilight films.
I call them Twilight films.
Twilight.
So. Vampires. I've never liked the sense. Well, you know what? Never mind what I've liked or haven't liked. I like American Vampire, Don.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the next thing I was going to say was American Vampire does a really great job of delivering to me a vampire story that includes a lot of the things that I've always liked about vampires and adding its own spin that in ways that I think are really clever and better than, I mean, everybody when they deliver their vampire stuff anymore seems to put their own spin on it, but this is a really, really cool spin.
Yeah, I was surprised when it opens. I seen covers of this. I'd seen some stuff for it. Now, I still don't know how I'm supposed to feel about the characters. About exactly who's good and who's bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I should say, okay, so there's, what is his name?
Skinner Sweet.
Skinner Sweet.
The first American vampire.
Yeah, and I like that name has great meaning in this. I like the parallels with just the, American experience and the newness of America to the rest of the world, even today, 200 years after our Declaration of Independence. The United States is still new, so the idea of something new on the scene and then that would produce a new vampire is kind of a cool direction. I don't think I've ever quite seen that before.
No, and all the way down to, I mean, you sort of just said this, but all the way down to the fact that the Skinner Suite is such a distinctly American name. I mean, it's not, there's so many American names that just sound, they could be European because so many Americans are European, but it's like these two words put together. He sounds like, he sounds like an Old West villain, which is exactly what he is before he's turned and appears to continue to be after he becomes a vampire. And I think that's so cool. And I think that one of the aspects of this story, if you haven't read it, is that he is the first American born vampire or made vampire by European vampires, he's different. He has different skills. He's stronger. He has different weaknesses, and it's just this really neat. And it sounds deliberate from reading the foreword and the afterword that Scott Snyder set out to say, no, I'm going to sort of, there's going to be parallels between this and America, and it's not a negative viewpoint. It's just a neat thing. Like, it's the new world, and there's a new vampire, and there are heroes in this that are distinctly heroes, and there are people that are victims that get righteous revenge, and then there's a really, really bad Billy the Kid monster type guy who is the central, that first vampire in Skinner Suite.
Wait, so you're saying Skinner Suite is the really bad one?
Yeah. I mean, at least in the past, because to give a little more context, the story is told, it's really two stories. There's one story thread that takes place in the 20s in Hollywood. And then there's another story thread, which is written by Stephen King, although Scott Snyder plotted the entire story. Stephen King's just doing the dialogue and the action. And it tells the story of Skinner Sweet from the late 1800s being turned into a vampire. And Skinner Sweet was this, notorious Billy the Kid type villain who becomes a vampire. So there's these sort of parallel stories going on. And Skinner Sweet makes the person in the 1925 story, this woman named Pearl, he turns her into a vampire. And that's how it ends up. That's basically the storyline.
Yeah, she's a character that is pretty cool. Although I found her character so sympathetic that I just am bummed out whenever the good people, the regular human beings become vampires against their will, and they have to live their lives in that what seems like a hell on earth experience.
Yeah.
I mean, but I guess that's part of the mythology, always a piece of the mythology of a vampire.
And in some ways, even the story of horror. I mean, in with this, it's not even like they were given a choice. I mean, we've seen those vampire stories where there are characters who are begging to be vampires, and Pearl is her name. Her life is basically saved by Skinner by turning her into a vampire. She doesn't ask for it, and whenever she's off doing her vampire-y, killing and sucking blood and stuff, it's in this righteous revenge quest. And in that, she's very noble in her quest, and she has help from a guy who is a former U.S. Marine, and he's also a good guy, and who she's taking revenge against are really bad people.
And who drew this?
Raphael Albuquerque.
Is he the same guy that drew the other Snyder book?
The Wake, or
no, not The Wake.
Severed.
It doesn't matter if you don't know. I was impressed at how handsome this was.
I don't think he is.
And I remember that same kind of, similar style, because the Wake is very different. That's the Sean Gordon Murphy, I think.
And he does. There's a later American Vampire sort of spin-off stories that he draws, which I would really like to see.
Okay. Yeah, no, same here. And I heard there's obviously a volume 2 to this.
There's like 7 volumes.
Okay. Oh, so it's a pretty big storyline.
And I think Albuquerque draws all of them, which I think is kind of cool too, or draws all of them in the main storyline, which I always like to see in that kind of work.
Yeah, I love that the villains in this, they're very, each of the villains, there's like 4 or 5 bad vampires. They're the antagonists in the story. And they're Skinner Sweet's antagonists because they're the old European vampires. And what I'm impressed with is the fact that they look somehow European. If Skinner Sweet looks American, they look European, and they're also very weird looking.
Yeah.
They also all have very small eyes, which I was sort of studying, from the standpoint of thinking about how, you draw things that look different and you establish characters looking different from one another and unique. And there's like 4 great designs. There's the leader who has this sort of, he reminds me of like a Sherlock Holmes type look. Then there's, I don't know what his role is. There's like a bald one. He looks sort of like Uncle Fester.
Yeah, and he's the one who infects Skinner Sweet. It's not on purpose, but that's how he's the one who turns Skinner Sweet unintentionally.
Yeah, and then the third one that stands out in my mind is one who's kind of on the skinny side, bald on top, and then has his hair sort of on the side, like sticking out.
Yeah,
You know what I'm talking about? And They're so sinister. He did one of the best elements in this book are the shots of the vampires when they're still sort of humaniform, and yet they're bearing some teeth or smiling strangely. Their eyes are glowing. There is scary, in a face as I think I've seen in a long time. I mean, equivalent to something that would scare me in a horror movie.
Yeah, and I go ahead.
Like there's a scene where Skinner Sweet is in his grave. He's been buried in Boot Hill, and they're talking about how they're going to flood the town where he's buried, and there'll be a vampire can't rise through water, and it's just a shot, I guess, of him inside of his coffin just smiling.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really creepy.
And he's a good villain. I mean, you really are scared of in some ways, the way that I think it is like sort of American storytelling in the very beginning, before he's been a vampire, he's just being taken to be hanged, and you meet, and he's a character we'll get to talk about because I want to talk about him. We meet his foil, or not his foil, but the good guy in that story is this Pinkerton agent named Book. And but you see Sweet is capable, and he's like a smart ass, and he's like, there's something sort of likable in the way that people like movies about Billy the Kid and things like that. And so, but you really become frightened of him even before he becomes a vampire. And so it even adds more, like you said, when you see that smile, like, because the European vampires are wondering. And in fact, the big fat Uncle Fester vampire is like, there's no way I turned him. And, and just in case, though, and he's taken all these measures just in case he did turn him. And then when you cut to that image of him smiling in the dark in his coffin, it's so eerie, and oh my goodness, what's coming next?
Yeah, and he's truly monstrous. Like he seems to be more than what he was before. And obviously he's a vampire, but there's a level of malevolence to him that is... I don't know. It achieves what he intended, and that's only done through good drawings. There's also these cool things he does with a lot of the characters, where they're sort of baring their teeth, and I'm always impressed with when you can do something simply. So, like the way the teeth are drawn, it's like if you had your mouth open so your teeth were exposed. They aren't even vampire teeth. They're just the indication of the multiple visible lighter spaces than darker ones, and he won't even draw the lip line. It just sort of joins the lip. And anyway, from the standpoint of simplicity, sometimes like you don't need the lines. Sometimes you don't need the line work, and that is something I can never get my head around. Like when I'm drawing, I get obsessed with having to try and connect dots, or at least I feel like I have to, even if I don't want to.
Yeah, and it's the use of negative space. The thing that I love about this is it's very rare that you find a comic that sort of has backup stories. So again, if you're imagining this, the volume reread is 4 or 5 issues, and each issue is split in half. The first half of the issue is the story in 1925, and the second half of the issue is the story in the 1880s. The first half is written by Scott Snyder, the second half by Stephen King. But Raphael Albuquerque draws both sides, which you rarely get to see when you see backup stories. So that was a treat in and of itself. But on top of that, when Albuquerque draws the origin of Skinner Sweet story, he uses like an ink wash effect. So it's not inked the same way. It's drawn the same way. I mean, he's the same artist.
Right.
And Skinner Sweet's still recognizable. But the 1925 era, he uses like these real thick lines. It reminded me a lot of the artist of, is it Gabriel? The artist who does Lock and Key, but the ink work reminded me of him, and then on the 1800s side, it's this real ink washy, it's real watercolor like look, and it's just neat, like that he thought to do that, and the effect of feeling like the present and the past and stuff is it's really, really cool.
So yeah, it's almost like when to indicate the past they'll use like sepia tones. It's not what is done here, but the effect is reminiscent of that.
Yeah, I really like the way that, because we started off talking about good guys and bad guys. So Skinner Sweet's a bad guy in the past, without a doubt. In the present, it's hard to say because he's sort of teasing Pearl. I mean, he saves Pearl's life by making her a vampire, and he appears to be sort of malevolent or benign. Maybe they're two different things. He's benign.
They're definitely two different things.
Yeah. He's benign in the 1925 part of the story. I mean, he saves her life.
He just sits around with his crotch hanging out.
Yeah. And then
I'm serious.
Yeah, and he's definitely interested in seeing like it seems like things went according to plan in the way Pearl reacts to the people who tried to make her into a vampire that he saves her from. So he's sort of getting something he wants out of the deal. But I believe it's possible, you know, with all the years that have passed since he was the crazy outlaw, that maybe the next time we see him in the present, whenever the present is, because I think the next storyline takes place in the 1950s, he could even be, he might not be a bad guy, or he might not be, he might be less of a pure evil. I don't know. But in the past, he's a bad guy.
Well, we don't
And
see him kill anybody that doesn't deserve it in the present, right?
no,
Or
not
the
19. No, you're right. I mean, and that's what I mean.
1924.
Like, there's an interesting, like, what's really going on here? You know, what happened between the 1800s and 1925 to him?
Yeah, no, yeah, that's why I said in the beginning that I didn't know who was good and bad, because there's times when he seems particularly bad, and then there's times when he doesn't, and there's that whole weird thing with the Old West, especially, where a lot of times there seems to be a very gray, at least in the storytelling. I'm talking not just this story, but just Old West stories in general. There's a sort of, I guess it's the Wild West is the bottom line, is it's wild enough so that the good guys have to be a certain level of bad, and we've always glamorized like bandits.
Yeah,
Some of the oldest stories have glamorized them. I mean, the pulp stuff that this is, the like dime store stuff this is based on, that was huge in Europe, you know, back, I mean, that's what's implied by the guy that's telling the story, because it's narrated by a guy who lived through it, doing dramatic readings of his own writing, and you know, in theaters. Those characters were always made, of course, bigger than life, and the bloodiness of their, you know, actions was almost bordering on like pornographic,
yeah.
for the sensibilities of the time. So anyway, it's interesting to think that to try and get your head around whether he's good or bad, and I liked that aspect of it. I like that he's clearly not a good guy, but you never are afraid that he's going to hurt Pearl.
Yeah, agreed. And in the past, his again, he's against the Pinkerton agent Book, and Book has a partner, a Mexican guy named Felix, I think, and he continues to taunt and want revenge against that guy, and all that guy's doing is his job, and he sets out to capture him because he's a bad man. Skinner Sweet's a bad man that needs capturing and hanging. And in that case, it's this cool, like, having it both ways. In that storyline, you're sort of rooting for Skinner because you want to see what he'll do next, but you're also rooting for Book, and Book never does anything untoward. Like, he never, like, stops being a white knight, even though, you know, however the story goes for him, he's always a good guy. So it's this really neat, like, even in when they have a final showdown, you know, you could go either way, and you as a reader I felt interestingly conflicted, because I obviously knew that Skinner, I knew that Skinner didn't die, but I didn't want to see Book die, and it was a cool balance.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the things I want to spend just a minute talking about is Scott Snyder's talent as a horror writer. I was thinking about how, you know, Stephen King writes half of it. And Stephen King, who I have like a love-hate relationship with, because there's a lot of things he does that irritates me, but I thoroughly enjoy a lot of his books. The guy really spins a good yarn. But there's things he does that he like can't get out of his way, and I think it's a really interesting contrast. When you look at the 1925 story, which was plotted and written by Snyder, and in that there's some harsh language, there's some violence, but there's nothing no pot shots are taken at anyone or at any group. Even when foul language is used, it's sort of appropriate to the scene. And then you go to the second half of the story that Stephen King wrote, and he's taking pot shots at Catholics. He's using derogatory terms for gays to like get effect. And it's just this funny thing that I'm like, why is Scott Snyder able to be eerie and scary without doing those things? But Stephen King throws them in willy-nilly. And it almost makes me wonder, like, on another level, because I do think Stephen King's a good storyteller, if it's like Stephen King's got to rely on stuff like that, and Snyder might have more confidence in himself, or he has more confidence in the horror that he doesn't have to do those things to get shocks out of you, or maybe I'm just judging it too harshly and it's just two different ways to tell a story.
Well, it's two different ways to tell a story, but Stephen King is, I mean, he's made a career out of being gross.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, just graphic. I mean, he doesn't, he rarely does. It's rare to find a story of his that doesn't wander and splash around in like taboos and stuff.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I like about The Shining. The Shining stays largely away from a lot of that, but the things he has is even his good characters are often sort of sullied, and he can't take a pillar of any community and not destroy it and paint all good people as bad people. And then it attempts to paint all flawed people as sort of the intrinsically good ones. And I don't know. So far, Snyder doesn't seem to have done that. Like Lock and Key is an example. I assumed that was going to be just some real... I mean, there's some scary stuff in it. Wait. I'm talking about Stephen King's son.
Yeah.
Who did Lock and Key. Severed.
Yeah.
In Severed... I just like that the boy in that is good. He becomes the old man by the end or the beginning of the story, however you want to look at it. His friends are good, and the bad guy's bad.
Yeah, and I really look forward to reading additional volumes because Dan, Panuch from the Comic Tango podcast, he was telling me that in the further volumes, he feels like the series is really improved by the lack of Stephen King, and and if you think about it, it's
he's like, don't quote me on that.
Yeah. Quoted. You're stuck. But I look forward to that because I am interested. And also one of the things that he said, which really intrigued me, was because when you're staring down the barrel, it was kind of like my thing with Lock and Key. Like I love the beginning of it, but 7 or 8 or 10 volumes is a lot to catch up on. And it's not like they'll go away. It's just a matter of remembering them, having a good list. The next time I need a good book, I know what to turn to. But hearing that the split storytelling, sort of goes away, and that which is fine in this. I think it's a really it doesn't bother me at all. But I like the idea of getting a solid 100 or 200 pages of just the one storyline, and I really like the idea of having Scott Snyder. And I mean, for him, when he had this published, he was still early in his career. So having the coup of having Stephen King's name on your self-published book, and it had to have done it. I mean, he probably owes a huge debt of gratitude to Stephen King for sort of propelling his career, because I'm sure there were tons of people to this day that pick that up because they see Stephen King's name on it. Even though in the comic book community, Scott Snyder's kind of a rock star now. But I look forward to seeing future volumes and seeing where he goes, and knowing that the different volumes jump in eras in American history, and that it keeps that up. And it's such an interesting and cool introduction to this world that I really want to see more of. And it's about vampires, something I don't usually chase after.
Yeah, I think it's just it has a really good storyline behind it, and it wasn't in so many of the things that vampire stories seem to dwell on. What I liked is that it was interested in the characters themselves and less about their, how they're dealing with their life as a vampire, or a lot of just sort of not self-indulgent, but when the characters seem, and often in vampire stories, to be sort of obsessed with themselves and their situation. And I like that this is largely action and suspense, as opposed to a real exploration of the mythology of vampires. Yet that is the backdrop, so there's plenty of it.
Yeah, and I really like that Pearl spends an appropriate amount of time disoriented and upset about her new condition. But because she gets right on with her Crow-like mission to basically take revenge and stop the people who did this to her, she would have been left for dead. They didn't turn her into a vampire. They fed on her. And they move so quickly into her mission that I really think it does a great job of avoiding what you said. It's not a lot of oh, poor me, and what am I going to be now, and all this self-exploration. She's left with mysteries, and she's just going to operate. She gets caught by one of the mysteries that Skinner doesn't tell her about, and she plans poorly and gets herself into trouble by operating, at the wrong time. And it's just it keeps the story so peppy and so fast and so eerie. And again, like you said, it's an action story, and action horror where people are proactive is always some of the best stuff, and always the stuff that I like the most.
Yeah, I like that she goes and she just is all action. I just love that she's sympathetic up until her death and shortly after it. And then once she discovers she's a vampire, she goes after the guy that brought her to the party, that brought her to the vampires, and she just sorts him out right away.
Yeah. And it's even cool that it ends with her. Like, I don't know if she continues to be part of the story, but it's cool because it seems like largely it's Skinner's sweet story. But it's neat that it ends with her sort of going off, and she's kind of a good guy. Like, who knows what she's going to go do, because she's yet to harm anyone who didn't earn it. And you know, and she just, I really like the way it goes. So we've got do you have anything else you want to say about Southern Bastards before we move on or Southern Bastards, before we move on from American
to Southern Bastards,
to a letter about Southern Bastards? Sorry.
I think, Don, I think you've said it all.
All right. A couple weeks ago, we did an episode on Southern Bastards, and we have some fans from the South. I won't call them bastards because they seem to be not that, but we got a letter from one. Do you have the letter there, or should I read it?
I have it right here.
All right.
Okay, in keeping with a request, I'm going to read this straight.
Okay.
Hey, fellas, I thought I'd elaborate more on the question you posed to me on Twitter regarding whether I had similar feelings about the South as Jason Aaron and Jason Latour expressed in Southern Bastards #1. Great series, by the way. I'm glad y'all put it on my radar. I grew up in a small North Carolina town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It's a far cry from Craw County, but my hometown is decidedly Southern. People there tend to care a lot about their bass boats, coon dogs, and high school football. It isn't uncommon to see a circle wore out in someone's back pocket where they keep their dip. Also, there's meth.
Story took a turn.
The end.
And God bless meth.
That's a sentence. Also, there's meth. They're busting up a new meth lab all the time there. Not so much the fancy Walter White kind as the oh crap, this is going to explode any moment kind. I moved to the big city, Raleigh, 2 years ago, and although I'd have a hard time finding meth, I do love my hometown. He didn't say that. He says, hard time moving back. It's more quaint than backwards, and the bad elements are more unfortunate than sinister. My hesitation to move back is more about having restaurants and shopping and events nearby. My hometown just has a Walmart, and it was a big day when they started selling meth. And that's the day it upgraded to a super center a couple years ago. Places like Craw do exist down here, though. My dad grew up in such a place just a little further into the mountains. I've had lots of horror stories about that area, but I've only ever driven through it myself. I stuck to the highway when I did. The South is a wonderful place, but there's some darkness down here, too.
And meth.
Regards, Alan. P.S. Also, there's meth.
You say 5 cheers for meth. There's nothing funny about meth except it's very funny.
No. So, no, that's cool because we didn't know. We're not Southerners. We're Northerners. And
Yeah,
all we've got is China white cocaine up here.
Just the pure stuff. We don't have meth. I know that you can't get Sudafed for crying out loud. So,
No.
because I think it's all going down to Appalachia so that they can make meth.
Yes, you have to go a couple. You have to go beyond the timberline in the Appalachians before you get to the Sudafed.
The great Sudafed range.
Yeah. No, Alan. God bless you, Alan.
No, it was cool to hear because I was curious, and I know that we have a number of Southern listeners, and I was curious to see if they had read this and what they thought. And it was interesting to see that basically, he knows of that. And it's kind of interesting because I was curious how for every story you have to add a little bit of juice, and I was curious how much, obviously there's some hyperbole in the Southern Bastard story in order to tell the story, but it was interesting to hear what I suspected, which is it's still not all that far off from certain places.
Yes. What we do have is the Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens. This is a place where people still live in the woods.
Yeah, Pineys, they call
the
them.
most densely populated state in the Union, and there are still people sneaking around in the woods.
And the stories about them are great. They don't speak English.
No, they
never see anything.
Yeah, they just grunt and yell.
They have their own language, and they have pine tar roofs.
Yeah.
And the Jersey Devil. All right, that's our show. We're going to continue our month of horror topics next week. Until then, I'm Don. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Don_Garvey.
And I'm Mike.
Go to ECHORIFT.com to find previous episodes of our show and check out our new YouTube channel, youtube.com/ECHORIFT video.
This has been an ECHORIFT production. Go to ECHORIFT.com to learn more.